So today we're going to hear from Dr. Laurie Goodrich, who is the Sarkis-Akopian Director of Conservation Science at Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania. She's been with Hawk Mountain for over 40 years, and during that time has worked in all sorts of aspects of conservation, from overseeing migration counts to conducting lots of different research projects and numerous peer-reviewed papers. She has done work both locally and internationally and is known for launching many different collaborative projects, including the Broadwing Hawk Project, which is what she's going to talk about today. So, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Laurie. Thanks for being with us today to talk about this work.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be with you. And hello to all my friends out in Duluth at Hawk Ridge. I'm going to start with sharing my screen and jump right into it. Um, right. You see it okay? Okay.
It looks
Um, well, thank you for inviting me to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Broadwing hawk. Uh, the title of my talk is Conserving the Broadwing Hawk from Canada to Colombia, but actually would like to conserve it throughout its entire range. So that would probably should be Canada to Argentina or something. But I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about a project that's been going on at Hawk Mountain for over 11 years now, looking at the full life cycle biology of this species. All right, why isn't this going? Okay. So as mentioned, I work at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. We are also a hawk migration watch site in eastern Pennsylvania. We're located in the Appalachian Mountains. We are actually the first refuge ever to be set aside for birds of prey in North America. We're founded over 90 years ago and have a very storied history revolving around trying to get hawk shooting stopped in the United States. But I don't have time to talk about that today, but some other time perhaps. Um, Today, what I really would like to focus all the talk on is this bird here, the broadwing hawk. And I'm assuming since you're Hawk Ridge affiliates, you know a little bit about broadwing hawks. We know that they are a long distance migrant and birds are traveling. They're also a complete migrant, which means all of the area, almost all of the breeding range is vacated during the non-breeding season, and birds are going to somewhere different, as shown in this map here, which comes from eBird. And you can see in the orange and red is sort of the breeding, current known breeding range, and the blue area is their winter range, although it's much wider than what they're showing here. In addition, they are a forest nesting bird. They're fairly secretive during the breeding season, so oftentimes you can have broadwings right around you and you might not even know it. One of the reasons that hawk watchers, of course, and all of us get excited about broadwings is that they are highly visible during migration. Even though they're highly secretive and seem invisible during breeding season, the birds form these large flocks on migration. We call them kettles, and they collect together in large growing sizes as they move south. So they are quite conspicuous during migration and they attract a lot of attention from hawk watchers. They are the most numerous migrant throughout eastern and I believe the central flyway as well at most hawk watches, excluding maybe the Atlantic coastline, which they tend to avoid the coasts. So they are really a really important bird for hawk migration observatories to pay attention to. And of course, it's sites like this here, which is a flock over Colombia, could easily be in Veracruz, Mexico, or Costa Rica, that really get you excited about asking questions about what these birds are doing. Why are they collecting in such big flocks? Where are they going? All these questions that'll come through your mind, maybe even more when you're not seeing them and expecting to see them, but when you see them for sure. It's exciting, but you realize how much we don't know about broadwing hawks. So why did we get involved in this study? Of course, there was the question of what can learn about this amazing species. But the real prompt was our concern for their conservation. In the early 2000s, about 2010 or so, a lot of the breeding bird atlas projects where people were censusing birds across the entire state, which have been going on across North America, um, we're starting to conduct their second round of surveys. And with the 2 rounds of breeding survey, you can start to look at range changes. And for the broadwing hawk, this raised some instant concerns. This map here, you can see the red areas, the red and orange areas on the bottom half are all the areas which are showing declining populations of broadwing hawks. Some of those changes are quite dramatic, like in Maryland, over 45% decline in the breeding range, and Pennsylvania, it was about 16%. And if you look at the entire range, it's about a decline of about 10% or 11% of their previous known breeding range. So that was a particular concern. And Hawk Mountain being located just north of a big area of red on that map really brought it to our attention. In addition, in 2019 and previous analyses, the Raptor Population Index, which analyzes population trends at migration sites across North America, was also showing significant declines in numbers of migrating birds, particularly in the eastern flyway, but a little bit in the eastern Great Lakes as well. So because of these declines, we decided we were going to start to study the broadwing hawk. And our founder, Rosalie Edge, was commonly quoted early on to say, the time to save a species is while it's still common. And really, with a lot of the science that we're doing at Hawk Mountain revolves around that theme, which is let's try to understand a decline before it gets too severe, like what happened with peregrine falcons and bald eagles. Let's try to see if we can find out what's going on and provide information to conservation agencies before it is too bad of a decline. So we started this project in 2014. We started out actually with some grant funding from the state of Pennsylvania and some other places. But since then, we've been funded largely with private donations. We started this in 2014. So we've been studying broadwing hawks for about 11, 12 years now. And what we wanted to do was to study them throughout their entire life cycle. There has been studies in the past during the breeding season, quite good studies done in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s, publications on food habits and breeding ecology, but very little has been known, as you might imagine, about their migration patterns other than people seeing them at count sites, and very, very little known about their winter ecology. So we wanted to study the bird at all of their seasons to get a full understanding of what conservation threats they might be facing. Now, I want to just start out, because I'm talking to folks here in Minnesota, that one of the very first studies of migration in broadwing hawk was published by one of your co-authors, Mark Martell, is a Minnesota folk guy. And you can see the map there. This was published in 2003 in the Wilson Bulletin. They tagged 4 adult broadwing hawks, 2 from Minnesota and 2 from Maryland, followed them to their wintering areas. And one of the key points is that the 2 Minnesota birds were found to winter in the northeastern part of South America, whereas the Maryland birds flew farther south into Peru and Brazil. Now, this is sort of the first indication that maybe there might be something like migration connectivity going on. That big term really just means that maybe certain populations of birds are migrating to certain places, which could affect their conservation or conservation approach. So are the birds from Massachusetts and Maryland going to a different place than birds where we're seeing increases in the population? So that would be one of the questions we wanted to look at. So from 2014 through 2025, this past year, we have been conducting studies of broadwing hawks, both on their nesting grounds, but also by putting transmitters on birds and following them south. And I'm going to share data today from all of the sites where we've been working. And you can see that we started out in Pennsylvania. We had 3 different populations in Pennsylvania that we looked at for a couple years. And then we started migrating north into Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut. And with collaborators working in Ontario, the Simcoe banding group, we've been able to also add quite a few birds from Ontario. And some of the early results I'm going to share, we published a paper with the Smithsonian biologists that had tagged 3 broadwings in Alberta. So I'll share that with you. And then more recently, we've also been looking at the wintering population in Florida. So this is kind of where we've been working in the last 10 to 11 years. So what do we do? Again, thinking about we want to study these birds throughout their life cycle. The birds return from their migration usually in April or early May. And so we are out there early in the season, usually before the leaf out, looking for returning birds. And then up here in the upper right corner of my screen, you can see the first indication of a nesting territory is something like this. You see a tree with a stick nest starting to be built. And that's the first indication that we have that there might be a broadwing nesting in that location. Usually what we have done in the past to find where to go is looking at eBird, looking at where other biologists have cited birds, or where we know we have territories. Now, one thing to keep in mind is broadwing hawks build a new nest every year. Maybe about 5% of them will reuse a nest, but mostly they build new nests. So even if you know where the territory is, and even if you have banded adults, you can't rely on that to find the nest. You need to go out there and walk grids through the forest and look for breeding activity or this kind of indication that we might have a bird building a nest. So once we see something like this, we go back periodically and we look for something like this bottom photo, which is down here. You can see the head of the broadwing hawk perched in the nest. Oftentimes it's very difficult to see. They can be tucked down in there, but there's other things you can look for, like white feathers along the edge that suggest it's an active nest. So that's the first activity. It's actually one of my favorite things to do is just tromp around the forest and watch things. So good time of year. And then once we have a nest, we let them alone. We try to check back with them weekly, and we look for their growth of the young. We look for how many young are there. And early on in our study, we were also doing nest observations, looking at feeding and parental behavior. I'll share a little bit of that with you today. So breeding, what did we learn? What have we learned about the breeding season, at least in New England and Pennsylvania? We have learned from our observations at nests that we can expect nest building in the second half of April. They should begin incubating eggs by middle to late May, sometimes as early as the second week of May. And then we start to see hatching in June and then fledging in July. One of the things we looked at early on was trying to look at what the birds were eating to see if they were perhaps maybe there was an interruption of food supply in some of these regions. And what we found is they have a pretty wide array of species that they eat. They do eat quite a lot of chipmunks, but small mammals tend to be the most abundant prey item, followed by birds, usually songbird nestlings or fledglings, rarely adults. And then frogs and snakes are also a big part of what they eat. Excuse me. And this kind of coincides with studies that have been done in other areas. This is just two examples from the Wisconsin and Alberta, which shows the preponderance of small mammals for this bird. But in addition, sort of different proportions of amphibians and reptiles. And I think a lot of this has to do with where the birds are living. We probably would see a lot more amphibians in areas where there's a lot of wetlands. So the good news is they are kind of a generalist predator. We have seen them kind of shift their diet if they need to. We had a fall one year where we had a crash in our chipmunk populations and the birds did just fine. They just found prey in other areas. In addition, another nesting observation that we've been able to kind of chronicle, the dates, the seasonality of their nesting season, but also we wanted to look at where they were nesting. Were they selecting out certain habitats or certain trees? And what we found mostly is that they tend to pick larger trees, but in general, they don't seem to prefer any particular species, but they are looking for a nice crotch in a tree. So you'll see them within the canopy, below the canopy, but often in one of the larger trees in that stand. And generally, they average about 2 young per nest. And if we do have nest loss, it's often due to predators, other raptors, great horned owl, red-tailed hawk are big ones, and ravens are, which have just moved into our forest, are becoming one of the bigger predators. In terms of habitat, which is important to look at because this could be something that's changing rapidly in urbanizing areas, they do tend to use areas which are mostly forested and with a higher proportion of evergreen or mixed forest cover than is found in the surrounding landscape. They often are found near water bodies, but it can be very small, like a stream or a pond. It doesn't have to be very large. Okay, so in order to study them on migration, we need to put transmitters on the birds. And of course, to look at return rates and to understand how the pair bonding is and other things, we need to put color bands on the birds at the very least. So catching broadwings is not easy. It's something that can be done only at the nest site. Obviously, you guys are great at catching broadwings on migration, but you don't get a lot of them. So we need to find the nest in order to put transmitters on birds. Now in Ontario, they have been trapping birds along the roadside early in the season and late in the season as birds are getting ready for migration, but it's not something that can be done everywhere. So you have to find that sweet spot where the birds are congregating before they migrate. Anyway, I'll show you how we catch broadwings. So once we find the nest, what we do is we put mist nets. We put an owl. The most important thing is putting a fake owl near the nest in a kind of an open area. We put mist nets around that owl, and we put ourselves in a blind, and we have a remote control device that can move the owl's head and move the owl's wings, and that lets us get the attention of the nesting bird. And this has been very effective at trapping females and a little bit less effective at trapping males, but right now it's the only method we have, so we're using it also to trap males. And then what you hope to have happen is something like this. You put the owl out. I don't know if you just saw that bird came diving in. They don't always knock the head off, but this particular one did. And still the bird is not trapped. It went over the net, I think, in that time. So you can hear the call, that high peer call in the background. So this bird is definitely agitated and probably going to come back. So it does take some time and some patience. We usually don't prolong it. We do this for 20 minutes or 40 minutes at the most. And then if the bird doesn't, at that time the bird did get caught. So that's how we trap the broadwings. Now, when they're in the hand, as I said, we don't get the birds all the time. If we don't get a bird after about, let's say, 30 minutes, when we pack up and go away. Sometimes there's various things that can go wrong. Maybe crows come in and you don't want to attract crows to the nest, so you pack up and leave. But once we have the bird in the hand, we are color banding the bird, we're putting Fish and Wildlife Service bands on the bird, and we're measuring all kinds of things, the molt, the eye color, the wing, the mass, and all kinds of information. And then if the bird is a female, or early on we could only tag females because that was the size transmitter that we could get, but nowadays we can tag both males and females because they have smaller transmitters out. And if the bird is suitable for a transmitter, then we will put a transmitter on. And just to show the kinds of information that we can get even without a transmitter. This is two birds. I don't know if you can see the title, but on the left is a bird that we named Brune, and this is a male. He has blue color bands. And over here you can see his mate Paula has an orange and should have a purple color band as well. They have been mated since the beginning of the study. And if you, just to give you an information, just an idea of the kind of information that we're collecting here in these long-term studies is every dot on here is a different nest site for Paula and Brune. Their very first one was here by the roadside. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but the really cool thing is that they kind of bounced around on both sides of the road behind these houses. And then in 2023, they went back and used the exact same nest tree, which I thought was kind of cool. But they broke the pattern in the next 2 years. But the key thing here is they're not moved between years. They're choosing a new nest tree, but they're not going that far. Sometimes it can be as close as 50 meters. Other years it's as far as 300 meters, but it's always within the same sort of general core area of the territory. And then for some of the birds, we are putting transmitters on so we can understand their conservation threats during migration, understand more about their migration biology, and of course their wintering range. So during the early part of this study, we used these microwave telemetry transmitters that don't provide as much precise location, but they have pretty good locating and they last pretty well. More recently, we've been using these GSM transmitters, which operate off of cell towers, but do provide a GPS location. So the precision of the location data is really high, which allows us to zoom in and understand more about habitat use, which is key. So since the beginning of the study, we have tagged over 30 birds. I haven't added up these exact numbers, but you can see between Florida, wintering Florida, and up here in Pennsylvania, New England, and Ontario that we've got quite a few birds tagged. So what are we learning by putting these satellite units on these birds, or GSM units? Well, first, in the breeding season, we are understanding, we have a much better idea about space use and what the birds are doing, what kinds of areas they're using on the breeding range. And one of the key findings, this is a publication from 2 years ago, looking at home range size year after year for both males and females. And the key thing here is that females have a much smaller home range than the males. And that makes sense because the male is doing most of the hunting for the pair. So he's traveling long distances to find enough prey for the whole family, whereas she's staying very close to the nest. Her job is to protect the nest, so she's not going as far. And you can see over here, we found with 18 different females tagged, an average about 2.5 kilometers squared for the females, whereas the male was 10 times larger, over 21 kilometers on average. So some of the early migration data from Pennsylvania and our friends in Smithsonian from Alberta were published in 2020 in this publication here. And a couple of key things I want to point out here. I'm not going to go over everything. First of all, just looking at those yellow lines, you can see the two Alberta birds wintered up here in Venezuela and Suriname, or two of the three Alberta birds. One of them went down to Brazil, and then all of the Pennsylvania birds wintered from Guatemala south through Bolivia and Brazil. So it's kind of in this area here. And if you look at the gray graphs on the far right, what you see there is we had tagged 4 juvenile birds that had just left the nest early in our study. And all the others on the left side of the graph are the adults. And hopefully you can immediately see that the juvenile birds all wintered in Central America, Mexico, South through Central America. None of them moved into South America for the winter. So one of the key findings we have early on the study, although it's a very small sample, we need to do more on that, is that juvenile birds appear to winter farther north than the adults. We also have been able to sort of chronicle how long it takes to get from breeding grounds to wintering grounds, as much as on average 90 days during migration, which when you think about it, that's 90 days on one migration between breeding to wintering. And then they do the same thing going back north. So they are spending at least half of their lives in migration, moving from one place to another. So this is a bird that's really built for migration. And here's just sort of emphasizing a little bit of that teaser on migration connectivity. We had only 3 birds in Alberta that were tagged, but 2 out of the 3 wintered in the northeastern part of South America, and the other one kind of wintered down in Peru and Brazil, where a lot of our Pennsylvania birds are seen. And then emphasizing that first-year bird finding. So what does it look like when you tag a bird year after year and you get data year after year? This is just 2 examples. Rosalie was a bird that was tagged at Hawk Mountain. Female nested there. We had 4 different nesting observations or nesting years for her and 3 different migrations. And you can see that every year she went back to the same area in southern Peru. And then we had only had 1 point for this Brady. We don't have that many males that have been tagged, but Brady was tagged at Hawk Mountain as well and wintered very similar distance down in Brazil, but similar latitude to Rosalie. So this is one of the questions that we wanted to look at, was how do different populations, juveniles versus adults, males versus females, migrate, and do they winter in different locations, which again could affect their conservation threats. And just to sort of summarize, if we leaped forward to 2024, this is kind of a map showing most of our migration pathways color-coded by where the birds nested. And you can see not all of our Ontario birds are on here, but it gives you the general pattern in that we see large overlap between the different areas, at least for the eastern United States, Pennsylvania, Ontario, New England. The birds are all kind of wintering in the same area, more or less. So not a lot of differences between where birds are going based on where they're coming from. One of the cool things that we discovered in this study was something called pre-migration. And we first noticed it in 2 different Pennsylvania birds, but then we've seen in some of these are all New Hampshire birds that were tagged in southern New Hampshire. And you can see all these 3 birds all took a pre-migration vacation, let's say, and went somewhere, spent a little bit, couple weeks before they started their real migration. And it's interesting that a lot of them are going north or northwest. And Ducati, where I can't say her name, we have 3 years of data for her. And so this is shows 2022 and 2023. She actually went to different locations. She went to Quebec in both years, but went to different locations. And then in 2024, she went to a different location, but very close before she started moving south. So we just started to look at the information about these pre-migration movements to try to figure out which birds are doing these, and can we notice any patterns? Is it a bird that's been unsuccessful or more successful? So far, we haven't found any corollaries for which birds are making these pre-migrations and which are not. So maybe it has something to do with prey supply. There was a study in Europe on ospreys that do this as well, and they suggested that the females tend to make these pre-migration movements so that they get out of the territory when the young are just starting to learn to hunt, so to make less pressure on the prey, and that seems to make a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit more about the migration itself, both the wintering period, but also where the birds are going, and then are they stopping on the way? There was a paper in the 1980s that suggested broadwings and Swainsons don't stop and feed on that entire migration, but that doesn't really make sense to me when you have a 3-month-long migration. So just a little bit about where the birds are wintering. This is a location in southern Peru, and it was really cool early in our study to find three different adult Pennsylvania birds that wintered very close, within 50 kilometers of each other. But when they returned to their nesting area, they were over 250 miles apart. And they returned year after year to these same spots. And here's an example of a migration for a bird from Connecticut, three different migrations. She's flying down very much the same path to an area of Costa Rica where she wintered, so farther north than some of the other birds. And you can see where that is. And the interesting thing about this is that while a lot of our birds you find them in sort of tropical forest areas, this bird has chosen, or maybe didn't have a choice, is wintering in a palm oil plantation in Costa Rica, and each year returning back to that same area. So must be finding we're told there's a lot of rats in these plantations. And then we have birds like this. This is Hugger, who, by the way, our people can sponsor birds through our project, and that's why the names are kind of funny sometimes. They get to name the bird if they sponsor it. So here's Hugger. She was trapped in Ontario, and she's wintering down in Guatemala. But the interesting thing is she winters 2 years in the exact same spot in this kind of downtown Guatemala park, but got a lot of rugged landscape there, so she's probably finding lots of good prey. And then we have Catherine, who comes from the exact same area of Ontario and migrates all the way down into Colombia. So again, connectivity does not seem to be a strong pattern for the broadwing. And her wintering spot is in more rugged rural landscape of Colombia. We did a little bit of analysis early on to look at what the habitat was where the birds were wintering. And at that time, we only had about 8 birds, I believe. So something we do need to repeat. But in general, the birds, at least in South America, were using the larger tropical forest landscapes. And some of them were not in protected areas and were showing pretty some abuse or use by gold mining and other illegal forest cutting operations. So in addition to lack of loss of forest on the wintering grounds, there's also concerns. We have concerns about loss of forest in the migration. In addition to that, we know that there's increases in the amount of hawk shooting going on in Colombia, perhaps in other countries. So we want to be sure that we think about those threats when we try to work on conservation suggestions for the species. And one of the questions that comes up, of course, is, okay, if the birds are stopping en route, they need to find food on migration, where are they going? Are they just stopping wherever they seem to find a place, or are they seeking out certain kinds of habitat, in which case habitat protection should be a high priority? And this is just an example of what a stopover site might look like. This bird here is actually from 2014, one of the longer stopovers, about 20 days. You can see it was moving around. This is about a kilometer width apart here. So it was moving around the landscape, but definitely in an area which is predominated by rural habitats and a lot of forest. So when we look at stopovers, we decided to define stopovers as we didn't want to look at just overnight roosts, which probably could happen anywhere. But a stopover would really be a place where the bird is spending some time. And so we defined a stopover as any place that they spend at least 24 hours and are traveling very short distances. So in that same publication that I mentioned before, we did map our stopover sites for those first 14 birds, and you can see the dots here that indicate stopovers are occurring both in North America and in South America, and probably to a lesser extent in the Central American corridor. Oh, and on average, a stopover is averaging about 2 to 3 days, but some of them, as I showed you before, could be quite long. And then when we're just starting this year to look at the land cover around these stopover sites to try to discern if the birds are selecting out habitat like they do during the breeding season. And we did see on the longer stopovers, at least, longer stopovers being 3 days or more, that where birds are hanging out in areas which are predominantly forested. There's other kinds of land cover, but mostly forest. And if you go to a wider scale around that site, you see that what's available to them is much less forested. So this is a very preliminary result. We need to do better analyses of this, but preliminarily it looks like broadwings are seeking out forest on their migration. And it makes sense. They're a forest species. They live in the forest in the winter, they live in the forest in the summer, that they would look for forested habitat when they need to stop and rest. One of the things that we are starting to find is that as we follow birds year after year, is that there might be some areas where they stop that are higher priority for protection, perhaps, because they're used again and again and again. And this is just one area of southern Appalachians where we're seeing birds from both New Hampshire, Vermont, and Canada all stopping on their way south. In addition, we have individual birds that show fidelity to a certain spot. This is a bird that stopped more than 1 year in an area only 14 kilometers apart. We've had another bird that stopped 3 different times in northern Colombia, very close location to in each time. So there's some sense in our view that birds may be using the same stopover sites year after year, which again heightens the importance of identifying these so that we can work with local authorities to see if we can get habitat protection. We do have a graduate student looking at stopovers for broadwing hawks as well as other species in the Central American flyway. And so she's mapped land cover from the northern area all the way down to the south. And you could see that the proportion of forest is shown in dark green here, and it varies across the landscape. But more importantly, she's looked at how forest has changed over time, and this is from 2000 to 2023. And you can see in this area here, which is the area where Texas and Mexico come together. So there's huge numbers of broadwings coming through there. Forest loss, which is shown in green in this case, has been very high over the last 20 years. So that might be an area that we need to particularly try to protect forested habitat for the migrating birds. Okay, moving on a little bit, just a few examples of some of the recent research we have. This is, as I said, we've just started looking at wintering birds in Florida, and this is a bird that actually was tagged by our colleagues at Cape May Bird Observatory, and they named her May, and she wintered down near Homestead, Florida in fall of 2024. And this is what her habitat looks like, where she'd been wintering 24 and maybe before that. It's kind of an overgrown woodland in southern Florida. But unfortunately, when we went back in 2025, you see that area has been all cut down for development or more fruit farms. There are no more trees there. This is the same outlet sign, no outlet sign. And this is what we're seeing across a lot of southern Florida, but also happening in other areas where the birds may be stopping on migration. So this is something that we want to try to quantify and get a better handle on. In addition, if you go to the southern part of their wintering range, this is Forest Watch data. This is showing you tree cover loss from 2000 to 2021. And you can see in Bolivia, which you probably can't see that, but Bolivia is here and Brazil is here, that the patterns of loss of forest in the last 20 years has been pretty strong, pretty high loss of forest, and that we've seen some birds in our studies that come back down to these areas and end up in an area down, let's say, in this red zone, and then it looks like they don't know where they are. You know, they start looking around. Whereas normally when we see birds go into their wintering ground, they go there and they're there. But this is an example. Muskoka from Ontario went down to this area in Brazil got down there in November And then she started moving all around. And you can see that there was no more forest in this area she went to originally. And by January, she moved all the way over here into Bolivia and did settle down for the rest of the winter. But we've had birds that never settle down and just kind of wander around. And you have to wonder, does that affect their survival? We don't really know. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, some of our conclusions so far that broadwings do demonstrate high fidelity. They return year after year to the same breeding spots. This is not 100%. It's probably about 95% though that return. And most of them are returning to the same wintering spots. They tend to use forests both in breeding, migration, and winter. And that's important for us to know now that we know that we can work on collaborating to protect forests. And so far, we've seen very weak connectivity. So that from breeding populations to winter areas. So that doesn't really explain some of the declines we're seeing in pockets of the United States. The only difference is with those Alberta birds, there's a suggestion there may be more westerly populations may be migrating to different areas, which would be interesting to look at both in the central flyway and in the western flyway. We do know that immature birds do winter farther north, and we need more data on male birds. We have only tagged about 5 out of all the 35 or so birds we've tagged have been males. So what's next for us? Well, here's the exciting news. Maybe you already know this, but we are working with Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory to expand this project to the Central Flyway and to be working in Minnesota this summer to find nests in and around Duluth so that we can put transmitters on birds from Minnesota and understand where they're going and how they migrate. Now, keeping in mind, we do have those 2 birds from way back when that were tagged, but those birds did not have GPS transmitters. So having birds with GPS transmitters will allow us to look at habitat use, both on the breeding grounds, on migration and wintering, but also to understand a little bit more about this migration connectivity question, which is really important to conservation. In addition, we would like to expand our outreach on habitat conservation now that we have 10 years of data, expand in our education use of our data. I'll share with you in a minute, but we have a lot of interest and use happening now in New Hampshire schools. And we think that really could be expanded. Kids really love this kind of data. They can dig their imaginations into and look at day by day where the birds are going. It's really useful for a lot of different disciplines. In addition, we would like to tag more males and juvenile birds in the eastern states so that we can understand their patterns and if they're different. And also we're starting to have enough data we can look at survival and see when do we lose the birds? Is it in migration? Is it on winter? Is it in breeding? And try to really understand where the crunch might be for those areas we're seeing declines. So education is happening. You'll see some of that on our website. There's also people have used our data from Audubon, and they're mapping the migration routes of broadwings to look at, as part of their interest in long-distance migrants and conservation. We have a curriculum on our website in both English and Spanish. It's a little bit outdated. It relies on Google Earth. We'd like to see that revised. And we'd like to collaborate with more educators. So if anyone on here would like to do that, one of the cool things is you can go to our website and any of the birds, these are the birds that we've tagged so far, and we will put Minnesota birds on here when we get them, is that you can follow them outside of the breeding season. We turn the map off during the breeding season to protect the birds. But outside of the breeding season, you can watch where they go. And it's really exciting during the fall migration to kind of see the race as they move south towards Veracruz and beyond, and to try to see where they go. So that's there. You can look at it now. And I think I'm going to close quickly here with a couple of things. First, I want to thank all the collaborators. We couldn't do this without people, volunteers, other scientists out in the field finding nests for us. We could not be working in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont if we hadn't had teams of people out there looking for nests and monitoring them and letting us know when it was good time to come out and catch the birds. So thank you to all these great people and all the supporters over the years. In addition, I just want to highlight our private donors. Again, right now we are funded exclusively through private donations, and it really makes a difference. And I hope that if you're excited about broad-winged hawks and you're excited about trying to protect them and make sure that wonderful migration you see at Oak Ridge continues for decades to come, this new effort, we still need to raise some funding to support work in Duluth. And Hawk Ridge is all in on this. They've already got t-shirt sales started up and ways that you can donate to the project. So if you check out their website, you can find out more information. And any kind of donation, whether it's $5 or $5,000, can do a lot to help move us forward in this effort. So I think I'll end there and see if anyone has questions.
Great. Thank you, Laurie. That's so fascinating. It's incredible what you can learn about a bird with, 11 or 12 years of studying it. Truly incredible. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to either pop those into the chat or unmute and ask your question of Laurie. Maybe I will start. I'm curious, Laurie, I about the wintering location, about adults going further south during fall migration than juveniles. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about why that might be. I know for maybe some other species, that's reverse. So just kind of curious what you might think is going on there.
Yeah, I so that's another reason we really would like to tag more juveniles is to see the ones that we tagged early on were with that older transmitter type, and we only got 1 or 2 years of data out of them. And we do have a juvenile now in Florida that is still wintering in Florida. So what I'm leading up to is, do they switch? They should be switching if they're going to follow the pattern that once they get to a maturity, they should be going farther, going somewhere else. So we need to document that still.
Mm.
Um, I think what we see with the juveniles is that they migrate slower, they take longer stops. So I think they're just not as ready for this big migration. And I think once they get to a certain point, which is probably in November, in the cycle, then they probably just say, "I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna sit down." And I don't know if that's a hormonal thing, perhaps, which you know they want to just keep migrating, where they don't really have a destination. The adults have a destination. Now, some of them, I don't think I mentioned it as much. So we averaged about 90 days on migration for the adults, but some of them move very quickly and might get there in like 60 days. And some of them, of course, wintering in Central America are not going as far. So there can be as much as a month difference between their migration length because of where they're wintering. A bird going, like Frankie went to Costa Rica, but then you have another bird going to Brazil. So
Yeah.
all that's to say is maybe I'm wrong because that one bird is set, Frankie was sitting down in by late October in her wintering spot, whereas the other birds were down, took until end of November, early December to get to their wintering spots. But I do feel like the juveniles are just not ready and they don't have a lot of fat buildup and they have to do a lot more hunting on the way. And probably, this is where that biggest challenge is for their survival. We talk about juvenile raptors not surviving their first year, like 60 or 70% of them. And you can see that when you follow them south, you're like, just hang in there, buddy, go find another rat, fill up your strength before you go. But yeah, I don't know. I should be saying I don't know.
No, no, that was a good explanation though, a good hypothesis for sure.
Hypothesis, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Sean McLaughlin in the chat. He said, I think a lot about detectability of broadwing hawk, both in terms of available birds using a flyway and visible birds. Have you recorded any broadwing hawks flying at altitudes that you would consider not observable?
Yeah, that would be great if we could do that. These transmitters that we're using are not really recording altitude yet well enough that we can actually say that we know what altitude they're flying. I do know that birds are flying over, high enough that people don't know that they're got transmitters on them, which is that could be not that high, but yeah,
Mhm.
hopefully soon. I mean, we're using CTT out of Cape May, and they're always innovating new things. So we'll put in that request, altitude, and see if they can come up with for next year.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting question. There's no other questions in the chat. Anyone have any questions in the room that they want to ask?
Well, I think if not, I mean, I understand it's dark and late, it's winter, everybody wants to hibernate. Um, Feel free to ask questions anytime through email or we have a Broadwing Hawk Facebook page. Also something you might want to like and be following if you're on Facebook. And we'll be posting updates on our tag birds once they start um, showing some movement. And I should say, when we first put these cell tower units on the birds, so this is going to happen in Duluth. We're going to catch some birds. I'm confident of that. We're going to put some transmitters on. Uh, Once they hit Panama, they go dark on us. So there's six or so birds that we tagged this year that we don't know where they are. And the reason for that is that there's no cell towers, or there's not a good cell tower network south of that area. But the good part of that is the data is stored in the transmitter. So when the bird starts migrating north in March or April, we'll get a huge data download of where they were during that entire winter. So it's a very exciting time for us. It's a good time to be checking out our Facebook page. And certainly if you have questions about anything at any time, feel free to contact me or my colleague, Rebecca, because as you can tell, we're just excited about this topic and love to talk about it. So
Mhm. That's great. I guess, yeah, if no one else has any other questions, I'll just quickly share. Laurie, mentioned that you can support the Broadwing Hawk Project in many different ways by either making a donation to Hawk Mountain or Hawk Ridge. And we also are about to launch this t-shirt fundraiser coming hopefully in the next few days. So we'll look out for that and help support the project. And then coming up next talk on February 10th, we have Kara Snow from the Natural Resources Research Institute, who's going to be talking about some of the work that they are doing with eDNA in poop samples from birds and bats to look at invasive species. So it should be a very interesting talk. And I see that Pam has her hand raised with a question. So Pam, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not really a question so much as a thank you. I so appreciate all the work that goes into just like a one-line statement of, oh yeah, and we tracked all these birds to this point and we caught this many. It's like, oh my gosh, how many thousands of hours of effort that takes. So thank you for all those efforts. It's really cool to see kind of the whole cumulative thoughts on what's happening with them. So it's really cool. Thank you.
thank you for saying that. Yes. There's times when we're covered with mosquitoes and waiting for a bird that doesn't come down. So get to share that with Emily soon. But
Yeah,
thank you.
we'll definitely have the mosquitoes, I think. Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes, but thank you all for coming and hope you have a lovely evening and stay tuned for our next series. So thanks for joining. Thanks, Lori.